My name is Rufile Ntsege. I'm the DA's Shadow MEC for Social Development here in Gauteng. We are here in Burgerspark in Tshwane, looking at a closed shelter. And I want to touch a bit about the funding of NPOs. Over the past 10 years, the department used to fund about 2,500 NPOs. And the process that was started in November 2023 for NPO funding was an absolute mess. What it ended up doing is they started the process and it was completely botched. Instead of funding the usual 2,500, in the annual report meetings and questions that we've tabled in the committee, they are now funding about 1,600 NPOs. But this is also because the predecessor of the MEC, Faith Mazibuko, Mbali Hlophe, has left a complete mess in the department. One of the things that we see as a mess that she's left is, for example, there were a lot of NPOs and suppliers that were not paid in the previous financial year. So a lot of money will be taken out of this financial year to supplement money to pay those NPOs. So they were accrued, all these expenses, which have now reduced the funding available for NPOs and for operations in this year, 2024-2025 financial year budget. And because of that, I think this is why a lot of NPOs have also lost funding. But also across the country, most social development departments are reducing the amount of non-compliant NPOs. Before, they used to give them conditional funding. Now they're saying you have to be 100% compliant before you can even receive funding. And we cannot, as the DA, stand here and endorse NPOs getting funded if they are not completely compliant. Having said that, though, there's a lot of very compliant NPOs that unfortunately have also fallen through the cracks and have not received funding. This is where, with one of the oral questions that I tabled in the legislature, we found out that there's about 80 NPOs that got too much money than they received. For example, I won't name the NPO, but we heard there was an NPO that requested 500,000 and ended up with 5 million rand in their account. And then we also know that there's 84 NPOs that asked for funding and ended up with far less funding than they requested. So you can imagine the mess that has created, because it means those that were overfunded, especially if you look at that 5 million example, that money could have gone to a couple of other NPOs that really needed the NPO. But even broader, there's now a list of 6 shelters that are supposed to have been funded that we know about, and this was not even on the list, where they've just stopped getting funding. But one of the ones that are even more concerning is Ekhaya Lethemba in Braamfontein, which is actually owned by Community Safety and Social Development, and how the department stopped funding its own shelter. That is worrying, because how does a government shelter become non-compliant if it's even owned by government? So there's a lot of glaring questions, which leaves that our women, our children, LGBTIQ victims of GBV will continue to be stranded and will it means it's actually encouraging GBV, because where will the victims go? So, and for me, Ekhaya Lethemba is the biggest GBV shelter in Gauteng. For them to not fund their own entity is a concern. So we are worried about what's going to happen. But going forward, we'll continue to monitor how many shelters have been closed and how many beneficiaries were being assisted by those shelters, because then we can see how rife the situation is going to be. I actually think this GBV situation is going to become a pandemic with the close of shelters because of lack of funding. Thank you very much.